She is mentally unfit to manage her own affairs, Your Honor. She is confused, erratic, and a danger to herself. My father didn't even blink as he lied to the judge. He wiped a fake tear, glancing at the relatives he'd invited to watch my humiliation. I didn't scream. I didn't object. I just checked my watch. 3 minutes. That was all the time he had left before his entire world imploded. Be honest, have you ever had someone look you in the eye and lie about you to make themselves look like the victim? Drop a yes in the comments if you know exactly how that feels. I want to see how many of us have survived this. Walter sat down, smoothing his tie like he'd just delivered a eulogy. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, thick with the judgment of the aunts and cousins he'd packed into the back rows. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for Rati, the 29-year-old failure, the disappointment, the confused child, to start screaming or begging for mercy. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just sat there, breathing in the stale air of the probate court, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone but me. Miss Rati, Judge Morrison said, looking over her glasses. Your father has made some very serious allegations regarding your mental capacity and your handling of the estate. Do you have a response? Walter leaned forward, a predator smelling blood. He wanted the outburst. He needed me to prove him right by acting hysterical. That was the currency he traded in emotional chaos. If I screamed, he won. If I cried, he won. So I gave him nothing. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. I didn't look at the gallery. I didn't look at the judge yet. I looked directly at Walter. I kept my face completely blank, devoid of anger, fear, or sadness. In the world of psychology, they call this the gray rock method. You become a stone. You become uninteresting, unresponsive, and flat. You starve the narcissist of the emotional fuel they need to function. But Walter didn't know that I wasn't being silent because I was broken. I was being silent because I was recording. Miss Rati? The judge prompted again. I'm listening, Your Honor, I said, my voice even and low. I'm just waiting for my father to finish listing his grievances. I wouldn't want to interrupt his performance. Walter's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He turned to his lawyer, Stephen, and whispered something. Stephen wasn't smirking. Stephen was sweating. He was tapping his pen against his legal pad. A nervous tick I'd noticed 3 months ago when I first started tracking their movements. Stephen knew something Walter didn't. He knew that paperwork leaves a trail. And he knew exactly which documents they had forged to get this hearing on the docket. I looked back at Walter. He was confident, arrogant, puffed up on the lie he'd been selling the family for years. That he was the long-suffering patriarch holding up a crumbling dynasty. And I was the leak in the hull. He thought he was about to sign a paper that would give him legal guardianship over me and access to the $5 million left in the estate. He thought he was minutes away from total control. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle in my chest. It wasn't adrenaline. It was the feeling of a trap springing shut. He thought this silence was my surrender. He had no idea it was actually the sound of a scope locking onto a target. Proceed, I said, sitting back down. Let's hear the rest, Your Honor. Look at her lifestyle. Walter sneered, gesturing at me like I was a stain on the floor. She lives in a shoebox apartment in the worst part of town. She wears clothes from discount racks. She takes the bus because she can't afford a car. She has squandered every opportunity I gave her. I listened to him list my failures like items on a grocery list. But my mind drifted back to 2 years ago. I remembered the day he came to my apartment unannounced. He'd looked around my 300-square-foot studio with a look of pure disgust. This is embarrassing, Rati, he'd said, kicking a stack of books. I tell my friends you're finding yourself. But we both know you're just failing. Then he'd driven away in a brand new Porsche Cayenne, a car I later learned he'd leased, using my social security number. He didn't know that the shoebox was a choice. While he was buying $5,000 suits to impress people who hated him, I was building an invisible ledger. Every time he called me worthless, I transferred another $5,000 into an offshore investment account. Every time he mocked my boring data entry job, I was actually managing a $15 million portfolio for private equity firms. I wasn't broke. I was hoarding. I wasn't failing. I was buying. He thought I was taking the bus because I couldn't afford a Toyota. In reality, I was using my liquidity to purchase the distressed mortgage note on his precious country club membership. When he laughed at my thrift store blazer, I was finalizing the paperwork to acquire the shell company that held the lien on his office building. He saw a daughter who needed to be managed. I saw a liability that needed to be liquidated. She has no concept of financial responsibility, Walter shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't a father concerned about his child. This was a parasite panicked that its host was drying up. He didn't want a conservatorship because he loved me. He wanted it because he was drowning in debt. and I was the only life raft left. He needed legal control over my assets because he had already spent his own. He wasn't a parent. He was a predator, and that was why I felt zero guilt. If I were just a daughter, I might have hesitated. I might have tried to help him one last time. But I wasn't his daughter today. I was his creditor, and today wasn't a family reunion. It was a foreclosure. Is that all, Mr. Walter? Judge Morrison asked, her pen scratching loudly against her notepad. No, Walter said, a gleam entering his eye. He signaled to Stephen. We have proof of her incompetence. Irrefutable proof. Stephen stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a warning shot. He didn't look at me. He walked to the bench and handed a thick stack of financial records to Judge Morrison. Your Honor, Stephen said, his voice trembling slightly. We are submitting evidence regarding the mismanagement of the trust fund established by the late grandmother. Specifically, the primary disbursement account. Walter couldn't wait for the lawyer to finish. He jumped in, pointing a shaking finger at me. She lost it, Judge. She lost $750,000 and didn't even notice. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. My aunts clutched their pearls. My cousins exchanged horrified glances. To them, $750,000 was a fortune. To Walter, it was the only thing standing between him and bankruptcy. Explain, Judge Morrison said, flipping through the pages. Her face was unreadable. Look at the transfers, Walter shouted, abandoning all pretense of decorum. Over the last 24 months, huge sums have been wired out of that account. 50,000 here, 80,000 there. All to shell companies. All untraceable, and she did nothing. No police reports. No fraud alerts. Nothing. He turned to the gallery, playing to his audience. My daughter is so mentally checked out, so disconnected from reality, that she let a thief drain her inheritance dry. If we don't step in now, she will be on the street in 6 months. I watched him perform. It was masterful. In a sick way. He was framing his own theft as my incompetence. He was banking on the fact that no sane person would let that kind of money vanish without screaming. Therefore, I must be insane. Therefore, he must take control. We are filing an emergency motion, Stephen added, wiping sweat from his upper lip. We request immediate freezing of all assets and the appointment of Walter as temporary conservator to stop the bleeding. Walter looked at me then. It wasn't a look of concern. It was a look of triumph. He thought he had cornered me. He thought the missing money was the smoking gun that would prove I was unfit. He didn't realize it was the bait. He was right about one thing, the money was gone. But he was wrong about the negligence. He assumed I was too stupid to check my balances. He assumed I was the same quiet girl he used to bully at the dinner table. Miss Ratty, Judge Morrison said, her voice grave. These records show a significant depletion of funds. Do you have an explanation for where this money went? The room went deadly silent. Walter leaned back, crossing his arms. He was ready for me to stutter. He was ready for me to cry and say I didn't know. He was ready to win. I stood up. I didn't look at my notes. I didn't look at my lawyer. I picked up a single blue folder I had placed on the table at the start of the hearing. I don't have an explanation, Your Honor, I said clearly. I have a map. I walked to the bench and placed the folder in front of Judge Morrison. I didn't rush. I moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows the ending of the movie because they wrote the script. My father is correct, Your Honor, I said, turning slightly to face the gallery. The money is gone. $750,000 was transferred out of that trust. I watched every cent leave. Walter let out a bark of laughter. She admits it. She watched it happen and did nothing. She's catatonic. I wasn't catatonic. I corrected him, my voice cutting through his noise like a razor. I was patient. Judge Morrison opened the folder. Her eyes widened as she looked at the first page. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a map. A digital footprint, visualization. Miss Ratty, the judge said, looking up. What am I looking at? You are looking at the IP logs for every single unauthorized transfer, I explained. I didn't just track the money. I tracked the device. Every transaction originated from a single desktop computer located at 442 Oakwood Drive. That is my father's home address. Specifically, his study. Walter's face drained of color. He started to stand. But Stephen yanked him back down. That's hacked evidence, Walter sputtered. She fabricated it. And here, I continued, pointing to the next page, ignoring him completely, are the wire confirmations. You'll notice the funds weren't sent to random shell companies. They were sent to accounts held by Apex Consulting, a company registered in Nevis. I turned to Walter. A company you incorporated 3 years ago, using your mistress's maiden name. The gallery erupted. My aunt gasped audibly. Walter looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He realized, too late, that I hadn't been ignoring his theft. I had been documenting it. But why? Judge Morrison asked, silencing the room with a raised hand. If you knew he was stealing, Miss Ratty, why didn't you freeze the account? Why let him take nearly $1 million? This was the moment. The honeypot strategy. Because of the law, Your Honor, I said. If I had stopped him at $50,000, it would have been a civil dispute. A family matter. He would have gotten a slap on the wrist and probation. He would have been back in my life in 6 months, trying to steal again. I looked at Walter. I wanted him to understand the mechanics of his own destruction. I needed him to cross the line from petty theft to federal racketeering. I disabled the security alerts on purpose. I left the door unlocked. I waited until the total stolen amount exceeded $500,000 and the transfers crossed state lines. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the counsel table. That creates a pattern of interstate wire fraud sufficient to trigger a RICO case. The mandatory minimum sentence is 10 years in federal prison. No parole, no probation. Walter slumped in his chair. He looked small. He looked like a man who realized he hadn't been robbing a bank. He had been robbing a trap. I didn't lose $750,000. Dad, I said, my voice cold and final. I spent it. That was the price of your prison sentence. And frankly, it was a bargain. Walter was cornered. But a rat is most dangerous when it's trapped. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, yellowed slightly at the edges. She's lying, he said, his voice gaining strength. She authorized every transfer. She just forgot. He handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Walter turned to the gallery, his confidence returning like a fever. This is a power of attorney document, signed and notarized 2 years ago. It explicitly grants me full control over that specific trust account to manage family investments. She signed it right after her grandmother died, because she was too overwhelmed to handle the finances. Judge Morrison examined the paper. She frowned. The signature looks authentic. It is authentic, Walter said, smiling for the first time in 10 minutes. She signed it. She just doesn't remember. This proves my point, Your Honor. Her memory is gone. She's dissociating. She creates these paranoid fantasies about RICO cases because she can't face the reality that she gave me permission. The room shifted again. I saw my cousins whispering. Maybe he's right. Maybe she is confused. Even Stephen, the sweaty lawyer, sat up straighter, looking hopeful. If that document held up, the theft wasn't theft, it was authorized management. My RICO case would evaporate. The honeypot would be useless. Judge Morrison looked at me. Miss Ratty, is this your signature? I recognized the document instantly. 2 years earlier, buried in funeral paperwork, Walter had slipped it in front of me. I signed without reading a mistake that started the war. It looks like my signature, I said. Walter pounced. See? She admits it. She's forgetful. She needs a guardian. He thought he'd won. I let him enjoy the illusion for one breath. Then I opened my bag and handed over a second folder. That form gives you control of one account, I told him calmly. But it doesn't give you a place to live. I revealed the truth. I had quietly bought his law office building, and he hadn't paid rent in months. Eviction was filed that morning. I also bought the note on his house. I own your office. I own your home. I own your debt, I said. You came to take guardianship. You're leaving as my tenant. He crumbled. The courtroom watched his ego collapse. I slid a withdrawal and confession across the table. Sign it. 30 days to leave. Refuse. And the locks change by noon. He signed, muttering that I would always owe him. The doors burst open. Federal marshals entered with the U.S. attorney. Walter was arrested on the spot, perjury activating a sealed indictment I had tipped off months earlier. No one defended him as he was dragged out. Outside, the sky felt cleaner. I finalized the sale of his house, deleted his number, and walked away. Peace isn't given. You take it. And sometimes, the strongest move is letting them bury themselves.